I'm Shirley Cloyes DioGuardi. I'm Balkan Affairs Advisor to the Albanian American Civic League. I've made 30 trips to the region and 13 to Kosova since the end of the war in 1999. What my concern is, and what I think is appropriate to the group here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, is U.S. foreign policy in the region. I agree wholeheartedly with what Minister Gini has, the comments that he's made, and I just want to bring to your attention what transpired at our hearing. I know that I just learned actually that Ambassador Burns, Director Van Dusen, spoke here yesterday, I believe. I assume that his presentation pretty much paralleled what he did in the House International Relations Committee on Wednesday, which was to present the administration's so-called blueprint for the process going forward with Kosova. We were extremely happy to see that the administration is finally putting the Balkans back on the front burner. We viewed it as extremely dangerous that, we see the social, economic, and political dangers that are posed to everyone by continuing to delay final status resolution. At the same time, I was surprised in the hearing, and I decided to depart initially from my own testimony when Ambassador Burns said that he was very proud of the legacy of the U.S. government in the region over the past few administrations. And I frankly differed there, and I will differ here, and I think this is important. The administration consistently has not acted in the Balkans, whether it's Democratic or Republican, for the last 20 years without, a war, frankly. And it was the House International Relations Committee that should be proud, and the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, because we've seen a pattern that began in 1987 when the very first resolution on behalf of, well, actually it wasn't on behalf of the independence of Kosova, it was exposing the human rights violations in Kosova, HRES 162, introduced by Congressman Gilman and then Congressman DioGuardi. Dante Fasel at that time was chairman of the committee. The State Department fought this vigorously because there were many, many friends of Slobodan Milosevic, American friends, both at state and people who had known him when he was a banker. We see a pattern that emerges 18 years ago in which we have the bombing of Vukovar and Dubrovnik. The administration doesn't act, the Congress protests. We have the occupation of Kosova, brutal occupation by Slobodan Milosevic. It goes on for 10 years. The administration doesn't act, House and Senate protest. We have the Bosnian War. We have the concealing of the concentration camps in Bosnia, which led to 5 members of the State Department taking a moral stand and resigning. There was only one moment when the administration and state came together, and it was frankly not something, in my opinion, President Clinton wanted to do. When it became clear that Slobodan Milosevic's genocidal march across the Balkans 10 years out was not going to end without NATO airstrikes, the decision was finally made. But the point I want to make is I don't think we can be proud at that point, because by then, 350,000 Bosnians were dead. More than 10,000 Kosovars would die between 1998 and 1999, and 4 million would be displaced. Going forward, I think we have to say that, before I should say that, looking at the last 6 years, I think keeping Kosova on life support has been disastrous. And there are 2 issues I want to bring out. I think Ardian is very, very right when he says what he gave was the unreported truths on the ground. And we saw the disconnect between what was happening on the ground and what was reported very, very vividly in March of 2004 when the riots occurred and 11 Albanians, 8 Serbs died for a total of 19, and there was much destruction, but it was painted as an Albanian act. And this was an orchestrated one, and this was not the case, and this is something that we could perhaps go into later. But the misrepresentation of Kosova has been, as a source of violence in the region, has been the most destructive element of propaganda to the detriment of not only the region, but of the United States. And one central element to the propaganda is this notion that somehow Kosova is this potentially terrorist Muslim state in the heart of Europe. And one of the wonderful things at our hearing was that Bishop Mark Sopi and Father Luis Gergi, who are with us today, and Father Zephi, who did not speak, are leading Catholic clerics in the region, and they will attest to the reality of Kosova, which is hundreds of years of Albanian Muslims, secular Muslims, Orthodox Christians, and Catholics living side by side in harmony. What happened was not, in March, an act of fundamentalist Muslim terrorism. And I think that going forward, we have some issues that are in the vital interest of the United States. The House International Relations Committee has not supported the independence of Kosovo just because they think Kosovars are wonderful people. They realize that it's in our interest, our vital interest of the U.S., to have a moderate, progressive, Muslim majority in the heart of Europe. They realize that it's in the vital interest of the United States to have probably the most pro-Western, pro-American ethnic group right next to Italy in Europe. They realize that we cannot have a contradiction between praising free and fair elections in Iraq and in Ukraine, for example, and then saying that the votes of the people in Kosova somehow does not matter and must be decided by others. And finally, my last point, they realize, and I think this may be the most important point going forward, if we're going to talk about standards before status in Kosova, the mantra of the State Department, then it's very important that that not be a delaying tactic, in the words of Tom Lantos. And in my opinion, it must be applied to the entire region. And when we look at Serbia, for me, the most important thing is the denazification and democratization of Serbia in the post-war period. I believe that's the only way that we're finally going to see peace in the Balkans. And I hope that state going forward will look very closely at House Resolution 24 introduced by Congressman Lantos and Hyde on this topic. Thank you very much.
The reality today is a difficult one for Albanians, not only in Kosova, but over the borders of Kosova. And I wanted to comment on that. I think first you have to understand that under Resolution 1244, the UN controls everything in Kosova. There is kind of a governor appointed. He's the special representative to the Secretary General. And Kosova is not allowed to have a defense force. It's not allowed to have a foreign ministry. So here's a country. I mean, it's operating as a country, as it did before when it had complete autonomy, but it can't represent itself. I wanted to say that that's the role that we play. We are volunteer advocates for the Albanian people. The Albanian American Civic League does not answer to any government. These are Albanian Americans who have created a voice for the people of Kosova. Even though we're volunteers, we have to register as lobbyists, and every 6 months we have to prepare reports to the Secretary. Point, because no one in 20 years, I've been in Congress 4 years, 16 years working now as a volunteer lobbyist, has ever talked about changing borders. I know the Helsinki Accords and the problems that we would have if we ever talked about changing borders, because it would then involve many, many other changes. So I just wanted to make that clear, that while there's propaganda from the traditional adversaries of the Albanian people that there might be a greater Albania, this is total propaganda. The only thing greater that we've seen in the last 15 years is greater Serbia. And that's what Milosevic tried to do, and he almost got away with it, except for the United States leading NATO. So I just wanted to make that declaration, and I appreciated the opportunity to say that. And thank you, Woodrow Wilson, at least keeping half the state of Albania outside, and the other half was then put in the former Yugoslavia when it was created as a new state in 1921.
Thank you. I want to thank Congressman DioGuardi, Mrs. DioGuardi, and Minister Gini. I hope you're right, that there is light at the end of the tunnel.